Hello, and welcome to Shadow Wars. You've heard of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a symbol of Western unity, defense, and peace. But what if I told you that behind that polished image, there once existed an unofficial army, trained, armed, and protected by NATO itself, not to fight foreign enemies, but to manipulate democracy from within? They called it Operation Gladio. But it wasn't just an operation. It was an entire network. A hidden army embedded across Europe, built in the aftermath of World War II. The mission? At first glance, it made sense. If the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, these stay-behind units would activate, fight behind enemy lines, and resist occupation. But here's where it turns dark. Gladio didn't just prepare for war. It made sure the war mindset never ended. Even in peace, the United States, through the CIA and Britain's MI6, poured resources into creating secret stockpiles of weapons, fake documents, encrypted radios, all hidden in forests, basements, abandoned buildings across Italy, France, Belgium, Germany. Only a few top officials knew the full scale. Even elected governments were kept in the dark. Why? Because Gladio's existence relied on total secrecy and plausible deniability. By the 1950s, Italy became a breeding ground for this silent force. The CIA feared one thing above all: that communists would win elections in Western Europe. Not through force, but by ballots. And that was unacceptable. So Gladio evolved from a wartime contingency plan into a political weapon. Unofficial militias were recruited, some made up of far-right extremists, fascist holdovers, ex-Nazi collaborators, people who hated communism more than they loved democracy. These men were armed, trained, and told they were heroes. But what came next has haunted Europe for decades. By the late 60s and 70s, Italy faced a wave of terrorist attacks, bombings in train stations, banks, public squares. The government blamed far-left radicals, but investigators, the brave few who looked deeper, found something chilling. The fingerprints matched those tied to Gladio. Why would NATO fund terrorists inside its own member states? Why would the West risk innocent lives in the name of freedom? The answer, as you'll see, was a strategy so cold, so calculated. It became known as the strategy of tension. And in the next chapter, we'll look at what really happened. On August 2nd, 1980, the day Bologna's train station was bombed, killing 85 civilians in one of the worst peacetime massacres in modern European history. But was it a communist attack? Or a Gladio message, written in blood? Stay with me. August 2nd, 1980, a hot summer morning at Bologna Centrale, one of Italy's busiest train stations. Families were boarding trains, tourists chatted over espresso, children clung to their parents. At exactly 10:25 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through the main terminal. The blast killed 85 people and injured more than 200. It blew out the walls, collapsed the roof, and sent shrapnel flying across platforms. The shock wasn't just physical. It shattered Italy's sense of security. Almost immediately, the government blamed a left-wing group. Communist radicals, they said. Anarchists? And people believed it. For a while. But as investigators sifted through the wreckage, something didn't add up. The type of explosives used, military grade, the timing device, traced back to NATO stockpiles. And the people arrested, many were known members of far-right cells, some with documented connections to Italian intelligence services. That's when the whispers started. Whispers of Operation Gladio. You see, this wasn't the first time Italy had suffered unexplained leftist attacks. In 1969, a bomb exploded at the Piazza Fontana in Milan. 17 dead. 1974, a bombing during an anti-fascist rally in Brescia. 8 dead. Each time, blame landed on communist groups. But over the years, evidence began to point in the opposite direction. Declassified files, parliamentary investigations, and whistleblowers revealed a disturbing pattern. Many of the attackers were actually far-right extremists, trained in Gladio camps with full knowledge of Western intelligence agencies. But why? Why would NATO, the CIA, and Italian intelligence tolerate or even encourage terrorism on their own soil? One chilling phrase repeated in multiple reports: to discredit the left and justify authoritarian measures. The goal wasn't random violence. It was controlled chaos. Create fear. Blame the communists. Push voters to the right. Give the military more power. Keep Italy and Western Europe under strict anti-communist control. It was a strategy known as the strategy of tension. Fear as a political tool. Terror as social engineering. And baloney wasn't the end. Survivors of these attacks still carry scars, physical and psychological. But the worst part? No high-level official was ever convicted. Most trials ended in dead ends, buried evidence, or mysterious disappearances of key witnesses. As one Italian judge put it, we weren't fighting terrorists. We were investigating our own government. And still, most Americans have never heard of Operation Gladio. It's barely taught in European schools. Because to confront it is to admit that the good guys weren't always clean. But the truth, as uncomfortable as it is, deserves light. In the final chapter, we'll look at how the Gladio network was exposed and why many believe it never really ended. Because in modern Europe, the Shadow Army may have simply changed names. And it might still be out there. It was Inti until 1990, over 4 decades after Gladio was born, that the secret finally slipped into the light. Giulio Andreotti, then Prime Minister of Italy, stood before Parliament and admitted Gladio was real. A clandestine paramilitary network, backed by NATO and the CIA, had operated within Italy since the end of World War II. He called it a necessary tool of anti-communist defense. But members of Parliament and the public were stunned, because by then, the web of lies was already unraveling. In Belgium, a similar secret army had been uncovered. In France, Germany, Greece, even in neutral Switzerland, underground units were found, tied to intelligence agencies and NATO coordination. Some were inactive. Others, still training, still storing weapons, still connected to modern-day right-wing extremism. The European Parliament launched an inquiry, but the results were predictable. No major trials, no NATO accountability. The CIA denied knowledge. NATO refused comment. Files vanished. Witnesses recanted, and in the vacuum of answers, the truth faded into whispers again. But not everyone stayed silent. Former intelligence officers began to talk off the record. Journalists pieced together patterns between post-war NATO strategy and domestic unrest. Even inside Italy, retired Gladio members admitted being part of operations they were never allowed to question. One chilling quote from a former operative: "We weren't patriots. We were pawns. And when we asked too many questions, we disappeared." By the early 2000s, Gladio had become more myth than memory. But its fingerprints never faded. The strategy of tension. Create fear. Blame your enemy. Consolidate power didn't die with the Cold War. We've seen its echoes in modern psyops, in false flag operations, in the manipulation of terror to justify surveillance, invasions, and political crackdowns. Some argue that Gladio was a necessary evil, that in a world on the brink of Soviet domination, extreme methods were justified. Others say it was the moment Western democracy betrayed its own values, choosing control over consent and lies over liberty. But here's the most important part. No one ever dismantled Gladio. It wasn't shut down. It was renamed, restructured, absorbed. And if that doesn't terrify you, it should. Because when armies exist outside the law, when governments can fund terror while preaching freedom, who's really in control? Thank you for watching Shadow Wars. If this story made you question everything you thought you knew, that's the point. Subscribe for more truths they tried to erase. Because in the shadows of history, the war never really ends.